Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined by John Bencich, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Achieve Life Sciences, which is a specialty pharmaceutical company focused on addressing the global smoking, health, and nicotine addiction epidemic that we have among us, ultimately through the development and commercialization of the novel drug compound cytisinicline. Mr. Bencich is an experienced financial executive. He spent over the last 2 decades guiding financial and corporate strategy within the life sciences industry, also the technology industry. Before he was appointed to CEO, he served as Achieve Life Sciences CFO and Chief Operating Officer. And prior to joining the company, served as the CFO of OncoGenex Pharmaceuticals, and a publicly traded biotech company. Previously, he served as the CFO of Integrated Diagnostics and Allozyne, both private VC-backed companies. Earlier in his career, he served as both the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer of Trubion Pharmaceuticals, a publicly traded biotech company, where he helped complete the a successful sale of that company to Emergent BioSolutions. And prior to that, led the global financial operations for Onyx Software Corporation, publicly traded software company. John started his career originally at Ernst & Young, graduated from UC San Diego with a bachelor's in accounting, got his MBA from Seattle University, and was a CPA in the state of Washington for 17 years. Now onto some really interesting stuff that I'm really looking forward to discussing. But John Bencich, welcome to our show. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ira.
Needless to say, this problem of nicotine addiction is still with us in 2023. And, just taking a look at some of the numbers out there in sort of the public space, also your investor presentation, they're big. Hundreds of billions of dollars still spent with healthcare associated with smoking. We got over 1 billion smokers still out there. Major cause of morbidity around the world. Talk to us a little bit about sort of where we are in 2023, just from the perspective of this really sizable pandemic, let's say, of smoking and nicotine addiction.
This really is the pandemic that I think doesn't really get enough attention. Tobacco and smoking-related diseases are the leading cause of preventable death around the globe. There's over 8 million folks that are dying annually here in the U.S. It's close to 500,000. Yet despite that, we've seen no new FDA-approved treatment options in nearly 2 decades to help on this front. And we currently have no options available for folks looking to quit e-cigarettes and nicotine-containing vape devices. So, this is a problem that still needs to be addressed. There's 47 million folks in the U.S. currently using tobacco-related products. And we think we've got a potential solution that could help really move the needle here in a category that I think has largely been forgotten over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I'm a pharmacist by undergraduate training, and I worked in retail a long time ago, and I remember sort of just looking at the presentation. You have your sort of your nicotine replacement stuff, and then some repurposed antidepressants and so forth. I was like, wow, that's what we were dispensing 30 years ago. And it's just it's interesting how the industry really they dropped the ball on this one because it is so prevalent. It's interesting looking at cystanicline, which it's a compound, natural product, alkaloid, been around for a little bit, some other places, but not here, not in, I guess, many parts of the world. It gets me thinking a lot of some of the other topics along this line we touched on the show, things like metformin, which it's a major diabetes drug nowadays. There was a good 40-year lag between when it was launched in Europe and by the time we got in the United States. What's the story on this compound in particular? I know it was hot in, I guess, Eastern Europe and New Zealand, I think, but talk about how you got focused on it and picked it up.
It's a really interesting story. So this is a naturally derived compound. The origins go all the way back to World War II, when some of the Russian troops were in the Balkans. Their supply lines got cut off. They ran out of a number of things, including cigarettes. So they started rolling up the leaves of indigenous native plants in the area. And they found that this particular plant, the laburnum tree, people had a lower desire to smoke. So after the war, a bunch of research was done. And in fact, there was a nicotine-like alkaloid in this plant. So they ended up developing this, getting cytisinicline on the market in Eastern Europe. It's been on the market for over 20 years, over which time it's treated over 20 million patients. So a long history of safe and efficacious use in that area. But it's unfortunately, a product that was never going to be brought to the US or any major markets. The originators of the compound out east, they are really focused to kind of ex-Soviet countries in, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Bulgaria, kind of everything kind of Eastern. So, we identified this as an interesting compound, and, you've probably seen it over the years. There's been a lot of interesting compounds that never lived up to their promise. So I think we had a high degree of skepticism early on, and we worked with the regulators, Cancer Research UK, as well as some investigators down in New Zealand, to run some, effectively proof of concept trials to validate the historical data sets. And everything we've seen so far has really confirmed that historical data. We early on it showed we were about 3.5 times better than placebo, and then also better than nicotine replacement therapy. And that really set the foundation to drive this program forward.
Awesome. Yeah, I like that. Those parts of the story. One, well, of course, natural product, having some background there, but at the same time, sort of this repurposing theme and sort of finding new uses for something that might have been forgotten to the time. But talk a little bit about mechanism here, because again, this is a lot going on up here inside the skull. In specific, here you have to deal with obviously the nicotine component of smoking and vaping, and sort of the biology that goes on there with the stimulation of the receptors, and then also all the pleasure on the back end of the dopamine release. And it seems like you have some really interesting MOA happening there in the way that this compound does its blocking, but also sort of a slow, let's say, normalization of both the release of the dopamine as well as sort of a reconditioning of the nicotinic receptors. Say some words about this, if you would.
Yeah, so we think the mechanism is really on point for treating nicotine addiction. And so if you think about a user of nicotine, typically what you'll find is that the nicotine receptors in the brain will overpopulate. So as they continue to look for more of the nicotine to get that dopamine release, that's typically how it's presented. So cytisinicline works directly on those nicotinic receptors, and it works as a partial agonist antagonist. So in one sense, it comes in and it blocks the receptors. So if you continue to smoke while using the product, or really any form of nicotine use, you don't get the same pleasure and satisfaction that you normally would, because the nicotine can't get into the receptors. But it does partially stimulate the receptor. So you do get a little bit of the buzz associated with nicotine use, albeit at much lower levels. And that helps with the cravings and withdrawal symptoms. And this is really a validated target. There's been a lot of work done around this mechanism. And the key difference that we have versus the one other product on the market that also shares this mechanism, which is varenicline or Chantix, is that cytisinicline is highly specific to the nicotine receptors. And so what it leads to is better tolerability. Chantix in particular has a number of off-target effects, which leads to a high rate of adverse events, in particular, roughly a 28% of nausea, which is in the label. And we've actually seen more nausea on the placebo arms in our trials than we've seen on active. So, I think in this category in particular, safety and tolerability, I think, is really critical. Now, this is not, an oncology setting where people are willing to put themselves through just about anything to survive. This is more elective, and I think if people feel terrible on the medication, they're less likely to comply and less likely to have a positive result on the outcomes.
And, speaking of positive results, you just recently, you wrapped up a phase 2 study called, it was called Orca V1, specifically looking at safety and efficacy of the substance, focused on vaping cessation. And as you pointed out at the beginning, this is something that no products for, and, that still United States with these e-cigarettes, close to 10 million users. Walk us through a little bit about some of the top line findings with regard to Orca V1, and a little bit, if you could just, what's the I'm not a smoker, but I just, when it comes to sort of vaping issues, or the issues associated with vaping withdrawal versus cigarettes, are there differences? Are there any unique things you got to think about with this particular patient population? I have no experience with that, so I'm just wondering if there are any fun facts along the way.
Yeah, well, so this is, this was a proof of concept trial in e-cigarette users, and we were fortunate enough to get a grant from NIDA and NIH to help support this trial. They've deemed cytisinicline a drug of national public health importance. And they've stepped up in a number of ways throughout our development cycle, including, partially funding this trial, which we're very thankful for. And so in this setting, one of the key differences we've seen is actually a much younger demographic compared to what we're seeing on the cigarette smoking side. That's probably the primary difference. So, in the trials we've seen on the smoking side, it's mid-50s typically is what we're seeing. For the vaping trial, Orca V1, we saw mid-30s, so almost 2 decades younger. And majority of them were former smokers that used e-cigarettes to try to quit, and now we're hooked on e-cigarettes. And then the other third or so in this trial were younger folks that never smoked. And I think that's one of the sad things is, we've seen huge strides over the last many decades in terms of reducing new folks coming to cigarette smoking. And now with the advent of Juul and these other popular products, we've seen a new epidemic of youth, who are going to be nicotine addicts that never would have picked up a cigarette to begin with. So this was a category that we'd been quite interested in exploring. Based on the mechanism of action, we should have activity in any form of nicotine addiction, whether it's smoking, vaping, chewing tobacco, snooze, you name it. It just so happens that vaping is the next largest segment that made sense to go after. And as I mentioned earlier, all the products on the market today for smoking cessation are all generic. So no one has been looking into, whether there's applicability in the vaping segment. So we really see this as an untapped opportunity and an opportunity to transition this product from not just being an aid to smoking cessation, but a treatment for nicotine addiction more broadly. So This study was run in 160 nicotine e-cigarette users, really looking at 12 weeks of treatment with a 2-to-1 randomization, so twice as many on active as placebo. And what we found was a 2.6 higher likelihood of quitting with folks on our treatment arm compared to placebo. And as that presented, it was about a 32% quit rate at the last 4 weeks of therapy, compared to 15% on placebo. And that was statistically significant, which was quite remarkable for such a small trial. And that 4-week consecutive abstinence rate is effectively the FDA approvable endpoint, at least using smoking as a proxy. So we were very, very happy to see that. And I think what we've always seen historically is a very tolerable profile, and that continued to resonate in the recent findings that we announced a couple weeks back.
And so clearly that study leads to the design of a phase 3 and potential registration. You additionally have the other Orca studies going. I mean, you have data coming in, I think, in a little bit from Orca 3, which is phase 3 for traditional cigarette smoking. What are the plans in sort of both these directions? And tell us a little bit what's happening and what's coming up.
So the focus on our side has really been, let's get this product on the market as quick as we can. Again, given the fact that we haven't seen any new treatments in almost 2 decades. The smoking cessation indication is the front runner at the moment. We've completed 1 phase 3 trial that read out last April in 2022. That was a success, and we validated both 6 and 12 weeks of therapy. And so the second confirmatory trial that's at 20 different centers in nearly 800 subjects will read out in the second quarter of 23. So that is imminently upon us as we speak here. With that trial in hand, we'll be looking at moving forward in the smoking cessation indication, getting that on the market. And in parallel, we'll have discussions with FDA around what's the appropriate path to move forward for an expanded indication to open it up for vaping cessation as well. And our belief is that a single phase 3 trial is likely what will be required for approval. And that will likely happen, perhaps a year into the commercialization for the smoking cessation indication.
Excellent. I know there's obviously as biotech companies, there's a limited amount of direction you can go, but nonetheless, when we're talking about some of these mechanisms per the nicotinic receptors and dopamine release and all that, clearly there's a lot of unique pharmacology there that goes beyond nicotine and smoking withdrawal. I mean, not plans, but as you guys sit around strategizing about, what the future potentially looks like, you get these to market, you're making billions of dollars. Other interesting sort of neuro indications that you dream about related to some of these mechanisms?
Yeah, so we are in the interruption of that dopamine cycle, as I illustrated earlier. So, the bread and butter has always been really focusing on nicotine addiction, just because we know the most about that. But I think interrupting that cycle, there is, there could be applicability in other forms of addictions, whether it be opioids, eating, gambling. I mean, there's a number of interesting areas that we could explore. I think in the near term, we'll continue to stay focused on the nicotine dependent side of things. There's still, I think, a couple of other categories that probably make sense to go after there. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of chewing tobacco or snus, things like that are also growing segments with no available treatment options. So it's an interesting compound. And I think, for us, if we're able to get this on the market in particular to help folks quit smoking out of the gate, that's going to be a huge win. Just given the fact that this area has been really so unloved over the last couple of decades, it could really use another treatment option.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next point. I mean, I interview a lot of biotechs on the show, and sort of 99% of the time, sort of the strategic plan is get some decent phase 2 data and hope Pfizer or JSK or Roche comes along and writes a big check. In your case, it looks like the strategy is sort of the other holy grail of things here in the industry, sort of becoming that FIPCO, a fully integrated, well, in this case, specialty pharmaceutical company. You have people on your team that have a lot of experience in marketing and commercializing drugs. Talk about what that's been like, in the sense of, very few of us ever become a commercial pharma company, but it seems like that's the strategy here, huh?
Yeah, I think we're open to all outcomes here. So, I think we'd welcome partnerships from, whether it's pharma or big biotech. I think any group that already has a commercial sales arm in place that this product could be relevant for. But with that, we will continue to march this forward to approval and get this on the market. And we see a real opportunity to do that on our own as well. And I think this has been, from a public markets perspective, challenging at times, because we're in an indication where there just isn't any other innovation going on. I think a lot of the industry has been focused on oncology for obvious reasons, but also rare diseases, orphan indications, things like that. And there's been a lot of work historically done around nicotine addiction. And, unfortunately, it's a bit of a graveyard when you look back over time at things that have been tried and failed. And so I think, people don't always have a filing cabinet for what we've built here. But I think here, as of late, especially now with the ability to expand into e-cigarette cessation, I think it's more topical. And I think we're starting to see some momentum of people, really getting a sense of what the real potential is here. And, as we've worked with a lot of the thought leaders in this space, we continue to hear that they believe that this product could become the gold standard on the other side of approval, in large part because of the really strong tolerability profile and the fact that we've been seeing single-digit rates of adverse events compared to, a category that's been really checkered in terms of the tolerability, including the most efficacious product having a boxed warning for suicidal ideations. And only treating, or only ever getting to about 30% of the market, which is a pretty unusual thing to see for the most efficacious product that's been brought forward to date. So we see a real opportunity of bringing this forward and marrying strong efficacy with strong tolerability, which is a segment of the market that frankly doesn't exist today. So that's the focus. And we think it's going to really resonate both in the hands of not only prescribers, but also potential patients here.
So yeah, I mean, in addition to the investor conferences and so forth that you have for the company, you're out there at different meetings. Last month you were at the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco. Very recently, Life Science Innovation Northwest. Anything else aside from the clinical announcements? Anything else coming up for the months as we get further into 2023, conferences that you're going to be presenting this data at, places that we can listen to you and meet you possibly, and anything else on the calendar that you want to mention, please?
Yeah, there will be some other forums that we're presenting at. There's one this summer that we'll present. It's a forum around naturally derived products that we think could be interesting. We'll have more data around that soon. There is a Society for Research on Nicotine Tobacco annual European conference that we're looking at being a part of as well. And I think the other interesting one that we've been working on behind the scenes is getting our phase 3 trial that was announced last year published. And we think, that deserves to be in a well-known journal, not something we can control in terms of timing, but we think, getting that out there, that in a recognized forum, we think will be validating as well. So we've got a few pieces there. And then in addition, we'll be working with FDA on the other side of our final phase 3 trial around any final points that will be required for approval, and then looking at really moving this into a new drug application first half of next year, so we can begin that regulatory review process.
Awesome. I'm excited for you. I mean, I love the story. Clearly, it is, as we chatted at the beginning, sort of one of these unrecognized pandemics. And I'm just, I'm so glad to see you succeeding on this particular path and with the business model, and really wishing you and the company the best with all of it moving forward. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been listening to John Bencich, Chief Executive Officer, Achieve Life Sciences, addressing the global smoking, health, and nicotine epidemic that's upon us with the development and commercialization of novel compounds. John, I want to thank you again for coming on the show and educating us on what you're up to. Obviously, thanks for doing it. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for creating a better tomorrow via what you do. Really great story, and we're going to continue to follow you and wish you the best with the development program.
Thanks, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great having you.